Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and let me say what an honor and pleasure it is to be with you. I want to thank Dr. Sugil Young for his incredible leadership of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for Korea, and I want to thank Ambassador Park for his global leadership that really brings us together here, because as he explained, he led the effort that brought the world together in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, June 2012, at which time the world's governments agreed that sustainable development would be at the center of the global development agenda, and at which time the world's governments agreed that we should adopt sustainable development goals. And those goals will be adopted, as I'll explain in a moment, just within the next few months. I'm also delighted to be in this beautiful venue of the Korea Foundation of Advanced Studies and in Gangnam, because this is the first Gangnam-style lecture I've ever given. And I will remember that, so I'm really excited about that. I will not sing it, however, or dance it. But it's a thrill. Why are we here? What is this sustainable development problem that we're facing? Why, in fact, maybe a little audaciously it may seem, do I say that we're in the age of sustainable development? I believe that we are in the age of sustainable development, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Though if we choose also to recognize our predicament, we're going to have a lot easier time about it. We're in the age of sustainable development because the core challenges that we face require us now to take a more holistic and integrated vision of global society. What is sustainable development? The term has been used now repeatedly, and we should define our terms. And in fact, sustainable development, in my view, means two distinct things. And importantly, we should keep them distinct, although you'll see that, of course, they are overlapping. The first is sustainable development as a method to understand our complicated world. That is, as an analytical approach to the world, and I believe as a new field of study at universities, and I believe it will also be at high schools and throughout our educational system. In that sense, sustainable development means a systems approach that looks at the interaction of several complex, interacting, nonlinear systems, including the economy, societal dynamics, politics, the technological systems in which we live, and the earth systems, the physical ecosystem and climate dynamics. So it's not a simple subject analytically. It is to understand how environmental dynamics interact with political, economic, and social dynamics, and how climate effects, for example, can trigger social or political or economic systemic change. Now, I said the word nonlinear. That's not a word of relief in this context, because nonlinear means that even small shocks to a system can have very large dynamic effects, and with feedback effects amplifying the initial shocks. So a drought can lead to hardship, migration, conflict, war, in a spiral of dynamics. And unfortunately, that is the nature of our world. It's one of the great dangers of our world that we press too hard on one kind of pressure and we see it showing up in very untoward dynamics elsewhere. Even in 2008, one bank was allowed to fail calamitously, Lehman Brothers, on September 14th, 2008, and within 2 days there was a worldwide financial panic. That is a non-linear dynamical response. Now, sustainable development means something else in addition to the analytical outlook, and that is a normative or ethical outlook. It's an approach to a good society. It's the idea that we need also to have a holistic ethical vision for the world to enable human flourishing, to enable people to achieve a measure of happiness and well-being. And it recommends essentially that we need to broaden our perspective of what's important in life and what's important in our societies beyond pursuing increasing income only to a holistic vision that says a good society is, of course, economically prosperous, but also socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. So it recommends an ethical framework which combines economic, social, and environmental objectives in an integrated fashion. Dr. Sugil Young mentioned an additional definition of sustainable development, the one that was first brought to us now 28 years ago by the Brundtland Commission, by Dr. Gru Harlem Brundtland, one of the great statesmen of our time. When she led the commission, the concept of sustainable development was first put on the world agenda in an intergenerational way, that we should meet our needs in a way which will allow future generations to meet their needs. That also is a normative view, an ethical view. It proved a little bit hard to handle, I would say. What does it mean to meet our needs in a way that lets the next generation meet its needs? So over time, from the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 to the 20th anniversary, the Rio Plus 20 Summit in June 2012, the definition of sustainable development became more about the interaction of economic, social, and environmental objectives. And that's a little bit more tangible for us, I think. And it has fortunately proven a way of engaging the entire world political community, the 193 member states of the United Nations, who could look at that objective of combining economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability to say, we agree with that. Now, as Ambassador Park would tell us, to have 193 governments agree on anything is not so simple. Of course, they agreed that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is doing a wonderful job, so 193 governments gave him the second term. That's a good example. And one of the reasons they so much appreciate the Secretary General is that he has been the world's leading advocate and spokesperson and rallying person for sustainable development. Now, what brings us together this evening is some urgency. The urgency of the crises that we face globally and the urgency of the diplomatic agenda to address those crises. It happens that we have 3 large negotiations underway right now for 3 summit meetings that will take place in just the next few months. These, I believe, are of decisive importance for our generation. because such meetings don't come along all that often. And it happens that they have all aligned in just a few months, which is also extraordinarily rare. And that alignment is also a bit of an accident, in part the result of our failure to address sustainable development in the previous generation. It happens that 1992 was really the centerpiece when sustainable development was first put on the agenda, but not heard very well in the world community. But at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, sustainable development was taken as an organizing principle, and 3 major treaties were adopted in that pivotal conference. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity to preserve biodiversity, and the UN Convention to combat desertification, to combat the spreading of deserts in the drylands. 3 big treaties. They're actually quite wonderful treaties, well articulated, carefully negotiated, adopted by almost all the world. But what brings us together now is that not one of those 3 treaties has been properly implemented. We have gone a generation failing to put sustainable development truly at the center of our global cooperation and development agenda. The Climate Convention, which is vital if we are going to correct our course as a planet away from profound, growing, and imminent global warming danger to a safe path, has not been implemented till today, 23 years after it was first signed. In fact, once you sign a convention, then you need to sign the means to implement it, what's called a protocol. And so it was in 1992 that the Framework Convention was signed. In 1994, it went into force, meaning that enough governments had ratified the agreement to put it into force. And the first meeting of the parties of the convention, what's called the Conference of the Parties, or the COP, took place in Berlin in 1995. COP 1, as it was called, the first meeting of the parties. On the third meeting of the parties in Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. And that was to be the protocol that set us on a safe path. But my country, the United States, failed at its historic responsibility at that moment. In the UN Framework Convention, it said that the rich countries should take the lead. But on the way to Kyoto, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution contrary to that treaty commitment that said the United States will act only when other major developing countries also act, meaning China. This was not what the treaty had agreed to. The treaty had agreed that the United States, as the richest country and the biggest economy, would act first. But the United States had a little bit of a psychological problem, thinking China's gaining on us. Kept looking back. Now we're looking forward, by the way, but kept looking back. What was going to happen? So the Congress voted unanimously, we're not going to act unless China acts. China said, but you just signed a treaty. You are an Annex I country, meaning you are a rich country. You go first. Well, the United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, even though it signed it. President Clinton did not send it to the Senate even for ratification. I happened to be in the White House one day in early 2001 when President George W. Bush was then president, and my counterpart with whom I was discussing the AIDS crisis said to me, "Oh, Professor Sachs, I have to go across the street now to announce that the United States is withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol." I'll never forget that. And the U.S. did withdraw. And China said foul. And so we had paralysis. And that paralysis continued. China continued to soar in economic power and in carbon emissions. So by the late 2000s, the first decade, China had overtaken the United States as the world's largest emitting country, not in per capita terms, but in aggregate terms. The idea then was in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen, we would now reach an agreement. President Obama had been elected. The world breathed a kind of sigh of relief that here was an administration that took climate change seriously. And the idea was that there would be an agreement reached in Copenhagen. It wasn't to be. In a way, it foundered again on the U.S.-China cooperation, and the conference was not properly prepared to reach the agreement, even though there were high hopes. Some of you will remember the picture of the world leaders huddled over a table, trying to find some way to agree at the last moment, not the way these things usually work. And they couldn't agree. So COP15 failed. The government said this is an utter emergency. We need to act. Now, when governments say this is an emergency, what do? In 2009, they say, we will act with urgency to reach an agreement in 2015, to go into effect in 2018, to go into force, to begin operation in 2020. That's the time horizon that we're on right now. You can imagine we have spent decades now in failing to implement this treaty. And therefore, our backs are against the wall, as I'll explain from a climate point of view. Now, what the governments did say already in Copenhagen, but then in Cancun the next year, was we will take a timeline to Paris 2015. And that's why we have climate negotiations to be completed this December. But take note, the last failure took 6 years to pick up the pieces. This one, the pieces might not be picked up ever again under this multilateral treaty if it fails again. I believe Paris is of decisive importance for this reason. Now, 2012 came thanks to the leadership of Ambassador Park and his colleagues at the United Nations. And the governments got together, and it was a little bit of a grim meeting, frankly speaking, because it was not a celebration of what had been achieved over the previous 20 years since the Earth Summit. It was a little bit grim in that everybody understood that the 20 years had been a worsening situation on climate, on biodiversity, and on desertification. But the crucial outcome document, The Future We Want, said powerfully, we must take even more decisive action to put sustainable development squarely in the front of the world's attention, and to do so by taking an example from the Millennium Development Goals, the goals that were adopted in September 2000, not as a treaty, not with legal force, but as a moral call on the world to focus on fighting extreme poverty. And in a way, they worked differently and in some ways better, but I would say in a complementary way to treaties. When you have treaties, you have lawyers negotiating. But when you have a moral call to action like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Millennium Development Goals, they don't have legal force, but they have a moral call that can capture some of the world's attention. So the governments in June 2012 wisely said, we need to make the moral call on the world and put sustainable development not only in the government hands and in the technocratic hands, but in the people's hands, so that these goals are the world's people's goals. And as I said, what's heartening is that these are goals that span across cultures, religions, income levels, and so forth, something that everybody can understand. And that was the commitment made in 2012. Now, that commitment was we will adopt these goals to be the goals that succeed the Millennium Development Goals. So they were set also for the 2015 timetable, for September 2015. So now we have two back-to-back crucial diplomatic initiatives. At that point, many governments in the General Assembly, and especially the developing countries, said, wait a minute, how are we going to implement these treaties? Where's the money? How are we going to invest? What is the real means of implementing these big goals? And so they called for a conference on financing sustainable development that could help to provide a framework for moving much more of the world's $25 trillion of saving every year towards the urgent agendas of sustainable development. Low carbon energy, sustainable agriculture, resilient infrastructure, health, education, and other basic needs. So a third summit was added to the calendar in July of 2015. Here we are, just a few weeks away to the start of 6 months of intensive negotiation. It is a kind of overload because it's typical that there's one such conference every few years, and here we have 3 back to back. In a way, it's very difficult, but in a way, it's uniquely fortunate. Because if we succeed in the next half a year plus 1 month, we will be able to change the course of the world truly towards sustainable development. Because finance, climate change, and the whole integrated agenda of sustainable development can be addressed now in these crucial sessions.